Welcome to Reformed Thinking, a deep dive into the historical and theological realities of the biblical text.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, glad you're here. So today we are looking at what happens when uh, a family dynamic goes catastrophically wrong.
Oh, yeah. Like the worst case scenario.
Right. Think about a modern corporate scenario where your own siblings conspire to, strip you of your shares in the family business.
Yeah, they vote you out of the boardroom, freeze your assets, and literally leave you on the street.
With absolutely nothing. And they just divide your inheritance among themselves. It is the kind of brutal betrayal that ruins people for life.
It really is. But, that scenario is terrible, but it is nothing compared to what we are investigating today.
No, not at all. We are looking at the historical account of Joseph in the book of Genesis, and we are focusing intensely on one specific statement in Genesis 50.20.
You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good.
Right, that verse. The material we are analyzing today includes these incredibly dense analytical theological essays, and they unpack the doctrine of providence, the concept of compatibilism, and how human guilt intersects with divine sovereignty.
And our goal today is to synthesize these materials to give you, the listener, a really robust practical theology.
Yeah, we want to establish a framework that dethrones the desire for personal vengeance, and anchors your faith during severe trials.
Because this is not a theoretical exercise to rack up trivia points. This has immediate application to how you process the worst things that happen to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We are definitely not framing this as some simple Sunday school story about, being a nice person and forgiving your siblings after they break your favorite toy.
Right.
We are looking at a staggering theological framework that answers a massive question. Like, how does God govern the wicked actions of humans while remaining completely holy and doing so to bring about the salvation of his people?
Well, to answer that, we have to start at the ground level. Before we can look at the high theology of God's sovereignty, we first must establish that these events happened in real space, real time, and real dirt.
Yeah, because if the history is fake, the theology just falls apart.
Precisely. You cannot build a solid theology on a fairy tale.
No, you can't. So setting the stage historically is crucial here. Where and when are we in the ancient world?
We are in the patriarchal period. Specifically, the artifacts and documents we are analyzing locate this during the Middle Bronze Age.
Which runs roughly from, 2000 to 1550 BC?
Yeah, right in that pocket. And this was a distinct era in redemptive history. God was dealing exclusively with the physical offspring of Abraham to establish the baseline for the nation of Israel.
Right, and the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East at this time was, it was one of emerging empires and established highly lucrative trade routes.
Yeah, and there is a fascinating archaeological detail in the text that proves we are in that specific time period. It involves the actual transaction price of Joseph.
Oh, right. When his brothers throw him into a pit and then decide to sell him into slavery to a passing caravan, they sell him for 20 shekels of silver.
I want to look closely at that number because it is not arbitrary. Extra-biblical documents from the ancient Near East verify that 20 shekels of silver was the precise going rate for a male slave in that specific era.
In the early second millennium BC, right?
Yeah. We know this from things like the Code of Hammurabi and the Mari tablets.
Okay, I want to pause there and make sure we define what those things are because they get thrown around a lot in biblical archaeology.
Sure.
Assume I have no idea what a Mari tablet is.
Fair enough. So the Mari tablets are a massive collection of thousands of cuneiform clay tablets discovered in an ancient city called Mari.
Which is in modern-day Syria, I think.
Right, modern-day Syria. And they were essentially the administrative and economic archives of a kingdom. They detailed trade, diplomacy, and everyday purchases. And the Code of Hammurabi is a very famous Babylonian legal text carved into a massive stone pillar, detailing the laws and economic regulations of the Babylonian Empire.
Okay, so when archaeologists translated these ancient receipts and laws from the Middle Bronze Age, they found a very specific economic standard.
Yes, the price of a slave was 20 shekels of silver.
And it is vital to note they didn't have minted coins yet. A shekel was just a unit of weight.
Right. They were literally putting pieces of silver on a scale. 20 shekels is roughly 8 ounces of silver.
But what is so compelling here is how that price changed over the centuries due to economic inflation.
Yeah, inflation happened in the ancient world just like it does today. As economies grew and silver became slightly more common, prices went up.
So by the time of Moses, which is the late Bronze Age, The price of a slave had inflated to 30 shekels, right?
Spot on. You see that reflected in the laws in the book of Exodus. And later, by the Iron Age, several centuries after that, the price reached 50 shekels.
Which is recorded in the book of 2 Kings.
Yeah.
Finding that 20 shekel detail in Genesis is like finding a perfectly dated receipt from 1920 in an old coat pocket. You know it's from 1920 because the price of a loaf of bread is listed at a nickel, not $5.
That is a great analogy. It proves the author had access to the precise economic realities of the Middle Bronze Age.
This historical accuracy utterly crushes liberal higher criticism.
We should probably explain what that is for the listener.
Yeah, definitely. Higher criticism was a movement, largely starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, where secular scholars tried to claim that the early books of the Bible were completely fabricated.
Right. They argued that Genesis was written centuries later, maybe during the Babylonian exile around 500 BC.
By people just making up a fake backstory for their nation to boost their own morale.
But a later author writing in 500 BC wouldn't know the precise price of a slave from 1,000 years prior. If they made up the story, they would have used the going rate of their own day.
Which would have been closer to 90 or 100 shekels by then.
Well, I mean, absolutely. The 20 shekel detail proves the authenticity of the text.
It grounds the narrative in concrete reality. And, another major geopolitical reality of this era was the constant threat of localized famines.
Oh, yeah. In the ancient world, if it didn't rain, you didn't have irrigation systems to save you. You just starved.
But the analysis we are reviewing points out that this specific famine in the Joseph narrative wasn't a random meteorological anomaly.
Famines were common, yes. But this specific famine was a decreed instrument by God. It was not an accident of climate patterns over the Mediterranean.
Wow.
It was a sovereign tool used to relocate 70 souls, Jacob's entire family, down into Egypt, specifically to the region of Goshen.
But why move them out of Canaan at all? I mean, Canaan is the promised land. Why would God use a catastrophic weather event to force the covenant family into a foreign country?
To protect the covenant lineage from cultural assimilation. If Jacob's family had stayed in Canaan, they were in grave danger of intermarrying and blending in with the wicked Canaanite culture.
Which we actually see starting to happen in the chapters right before the Joseph story, right? With characters like Judah behaving just like the Canaanites.
Yeah, they were losing their distinct identity. Egypt, and specifically the region of Goshen, functioned as a cultural incubator.
Now, Goshen was a lush, fertile area in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, perfect for grazing livestock. But the Egyptians had a massive cultural prejudice against shepherds.
They absolutely despised them. The Egyptians viewed shepherds as culturally backwards and unclean.
Wow.
And because of that prejudice, they left the Israelites completely alone in Goshen. They didn't want to intermarry with them or socialize with them.
So the Israelites were able to multiply from a family of 70 people into a nation of millions over several centuries, without their religion and lineage being swallowed up by pagan neighbors.
God used the Egyptians' own prejudice to create a secure wall around his people.
That is incredible. We see God orchestrating macropolitics with empires and microeconomics with things like the ancient spice trade.
Yeah, think about when the brothers throw Joseph into the pit at Dothan. They happen to look up and see a caravan.
Just at that moment.
Just at that moment. They see Ishmaelites and Midianites carrying gum, balm, and myrrh down to Egypt.
Which is a historically verified trade route known as the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea.
Connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt, right. And the irony is thick here. What are gum, balm, and myrrh used for in Egypt?
Embalming.
Yes. They are the specific spices used for embalming the dead.
Oh, man. So Joseph is being carried down to Egypt with the tools of death, entering into a living death as a slave.
Yeah.
If God is orchestrating macropolitics and microeconomics like a nomadic spice caravan, intersecting with a family betrayal at the precise minute necessary to move one boy to Egypt, how does that alter how you view your daily newsfeed?
I mean, it changes your entire perspective on history. God used the ordinary, mundane trade routes of the ancient world to execute his redemptive plan.
Right.
He placed a Hebrew slave in the most powerful nation on earth, raising him to the position of vizier, second only to Pharaoh, at the very moment the known world would face starvation.
God is directing the massive global events and the tiny, seemingly insignificant details simultaneously. There are no rogue molecules in the universe.
And that reality forces us to look at the specific grammar of Genesis 50.12. We need to understand the mechanics of how God interacts with human choices within that history.
Which brings us to the actual words Joseph speaks to his terrified brothers years later.
This is where the theology gets intensely heavy.
Okay.
The text hinges on one specific Hebrew verb.
Chashab.
Chashab, yeah. It carries the meaning of calculating, plotting, devising, or intending. It involves a deliberate, thoughtful plan.
The staggering thing is that this specific verb is used for both the brothers and God in the very same sentence.
The syntax of the clause is striking. Joseph says, "As for you, you meant chashab evil against me, but God meant chashabit for good."
There is an absolute juxtaposition there. And the Hebrew syntax does not give us a softening conjunction. It doesn't say, you meant evil against me, and then later God figured out a way to turn it around for good.
No, the contrast is absolute. And the most critical grammatical feature here is a feminine suffix attached to the second use of the verb.
Okay, unpack that.
So the text literally reads, God meant it. The Hebrew word is hashaba. The antecedent of it is the feminine noun ra, which translates to evil.
Wait, so God meant the evil itself?
That is the literal reading of the text. God intended the very thing the brothers did. This is the doctrine of compatibilism.
Okay, that is a huge concept.
It is the truth that divine determinism and human moral responsibility intersect perfectly in space and time without contradicting each other.
So the very historical event that the brothers intended for destruction, God intended for salvation.
Yes.
This is a massive claim. The theologians who wrote the material we are studying vigorously reject other theological frameworks here. They point out how this text refutes systems like open theism and Arminianism.
Right, and we need to explain what those terms mean because they represent how a lot of modern people naturally think about God.
Let's do it. What is open theism?
Open theism is a theological belief system asserting that God does not know the future choices of free creatures.
So God is just guessing?
Basically, yeah. In this view, God is essentially guessing what humans will do and reacting to their choices as they happen. It presents God as a cosmic risk-taker who learns as history unfolds.
And what about Arminianism? Because that's quite different.
Arminianism is different, yes. It affirms that God knows all future events perfectly. However, it argues that God merely foresees human choices and permits them to happen passively without actively decreeing or intending them.
So Arminianism tries to protect God from being associated with evil by making his relationship to human sin entirely passive.
Yes, that's the goal of that system.
But the text in Genesis completely shatters both of those frameworks. God is not an emergency worker reacting to human autonomy. He is not looking down at the pit in Dothan saying, "Oh no, what are they doing to Joseph? I better scramble and come up with a backup plan to salvage this."
No, the authors argue against the idea that God simply foresaw the brothers doing something terrible and then reacted. They also reject the idea that God passively permitted the evil.
Because of that active verb, chashab.
Right. The active verb proves that God actively intended the very same event for a righteous end, while the brothers intended it for destruction out of their own total depravity.
I like to think about it like two authors writing the very same scene in a play, but with totally opposed motives for the characters.
That's a good way to look at it.
The characters are acting freely according to their own desires. Within the scene, they are not being forced against their wills. But the overarching author has a completely different, grander purpose for why that scene is taking place.
That is a really helpful way to conceptualize the doctrine of concurrence.
Concurrence.
Yeah, concurrence is the theological concept that God cooperates with created things in every action. He directs their distinctive properties to cause them to act as they do.
Yet he does this in a way that God remains perfectly holy and man remains completely culpable.
Yes. God uses the wicked desires of the brothers' own hearts to accomplish his purpose without ever putting that wickedness into their hearts.
But I want to push back on this because I know what a listener is thinking right now. You are saying God intended the evil. If God intended the evil action and the brothers couldn't have done otherwise because it was decreed, how is God not just a puppet master?
Yeah, that's the tension.
And how on earth can you hold the brothers guilty for an action God planned? Doesn't this make God the author of sin?
That is the most common objection, and it is a necessary one to address. The answer lies in focusing on intention and nature. God's intention in the sinful selling of Joseph was not sinful, it was saving.
While the brothers' willing was driven by malice, envy, and a lust for silver?
Right. God's willing of the very same event was driven by covenant love for his chosen people to preserve them from a deadly famine. The physical action is the same. The moral quality of the intention behind the action is infinitely different.
The brothers are acting out of pure spite, but God is acting out of pure preservation. The hands of the brothers are filthy but God's hands remain completely clean.
And Scripture does not try to fully resolve the mechanical mystery of how two acts of willing, one human and sinful, the other divine and righteous, work together so flawlessly.
Because we cannot fully comprehend how an infinite God interacts with finite creatures.
Well, absolutely. But the text demands we believe both truths simultaneously. Man is fully responsible, and God is fully sovereign.
The grammar proves God's active, holy intention behind the evil. This forces us to look at how humans react to this reality on an emotional and psychological level.
Which brings us to the psychology of guilt and the posture of mercy we see in Joseph.
Let's set the scene for Genesis chapter 50. Jacob the patriarch has just died. 17 years have passed since Jacob moved his family down to Egypt.
17 years. During all those years, the brothers have been living in safety, sustained by Joseph's authority and generosity.
But their conscience has never been cleared.
No. They have been sweating out those 17 years, burdened by decades of unresolved guilt.
So they panic. They assume that Joseph was only being nice to them while their dad was alive to keep the peace.
They project their own vindictive nature onto Joseph. They operate on the law of retribution, an eye for an eye. Dad is gone, and now Joseph is finally going to pay us back.
They operate purely on a horizontal human plane. They don't have the theological framework Joseph has. So what do?
They fabricate a posthumous message. They send messengers to Joseph claiming that Jacob, right before he died, commanded Joseph to forgive them.
It is a desperate, pathetic manipulation. They are essentially using their dead father as a human shield.
Yeah, but notice what they say in that fabricated message. They fully admit their actions. They use the words transgression, sin, and evil.
They are not minimizing what they did. They know they deserve death.
And how does Joseph respond to this paranoid lie? The text says he weeps.
He doesn't puff up his chest. He doesn't lord his authority over them or enjoy watching them squirm.
He weeps because it breaks his heart that they still don't understand grace. They still think like pagan transactionalists. Then he asks a rhetorical question of jurisdiction. Am I in the place of God?
He refuses to seize the divine prerogative. Vengeance belongs to the Lord, and Joseph knows he is not the judge of their eternal souls.
Understanding God's sovereign decree over all things does not lead to cold fatalism.
Right, because many people assume that believing God controls everything turns you into an emotionless robot.
But it is actually the very fountain of tender mercy. Joseph can forgive his brothers because his robust theology liberates him from the prison of personal vengeance. He doesn't have to carry the burden of getting even.
How does this apply to you, the listener, when someone genuinely wrongs you? Because it is very easy to listen to this and think, okay, I just need to pretend the hurt didn't happen, sweep it under the rug, and move on.
But Joseph doesn't do that.
No.
He is incredibly honest about the offense. Earlier in the narrative, when he first reveals his identity to them, he identifies the wound plainly. He says, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold.
He doesn't psychologize their sin away. He doesn't say, you guys were just having a bad day, no big deal. He names the abuse.
Grace does not require amnesia. You do not have to pretend the sin wasn't horrific to forgive it.
Does robust theology actually make you more compassionate? Because in the real world, sometimes people who study heavy doctrines become very cold, rigid, and argumentative.
Oh, for sure.
They use their theology as a club to win debates, not as a tool to heal relationships.
That happens when people learn the vocabulary of theology without grasping the reality of it. The literary structure of Genesis answers your question. Well, this entire narrative is part of the Toledot, the generations or the history of Jacob. Throughout this narrative, we see the brothers acting out of intense pride and arrogance. But here, in chapter 50, they physically fall down on the ground before Joseph, offering themselves as his slaves.
Oh, wow. They are fulfilling the very dreams from Genesis 37 that triggered their murderous plot in the first place. The sheaves of wheat bowing down, the stars bowing down.
God's providence forces humility. Joseph's high theology allows him to look at these men cowering on the floor and realize, God sent me here to save you. I don't need to punish you. God has already broken your pride, and he used my suffering to secure your lives.
The theology creates the compassion. He doesn't just tolerate them. He actively promises to provide food for them and their little ones.
And seeing Joseph's staggering act of mercy forces us to look for a broader fulfillment. The authors of the theological essays are adamant that Joseph is not the end of the story.
Right. His life is a shadow pointing to a much larger reality. We are moving from the historical sandbox to the ultimate typology.
Teaching the Joseph narrative as a moral lesson on forgiveness is theological malpractice.
That's a strong statement, but true.
If all you get out of this text is try to be a forgiving person, you have missed the central message of Scripture. The entire Old Testament is a grand, unfolding drama pointing to the person and work of Jesus Christ.
And typology is the study of how Old Testament historical events, persons, or institutions act as predictive patterns or shadows for the realities found in Christ.
Yes, and Joseph is one of the most vivid, redemptive, historical types of Christ in the Bible.
Let's walk through those typological parallels, because when you stack them up, it is breathtaking. Joseph was the beloved son of his father.
Right.
He was sent to seek the welfare of his brothers.
When he came to his own received him not. They hated him without a cause.
He was stripped of his glorious robe. He was conspired against by his own family. He was sold into the hands of Gentiles for the precise price of a slave.
He was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, just as Jesus was falsely accused by the Sanhedrin. Joseph was numbered with transgressors in a dungeon.
He was placed between two criminals, the baker and the cupbearer, and one was saved while the other was condemned, just like Jesus on the cross between two thieves.
And yet he emerged from the pit of death to be exalted to the right hand of the supreme ruler of the world.
From that throne of exaltation, Joseph became the savior of the world, distributing the bread of life to starving, guilty men, including the very ones who sought to destroy him.
The Christological climax of Genesis 50.7 goes far beyond simple typology. It establishes the theological framework for understanding the cross itself.
How does the New Testament connect to this?
The essays point us to the New Testament equivalent of Genesis 50.20, which is Acts 4.27-28.
Okay, let me pull that up. The believers in the early church are praying, and they say, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place."
That prayer in Acts 4 is the supreme act of compatibilism. Think about the crucifixion. It was the greatest sin ever committed in human history.
Wicked men murdered the sinless Son of God.
Herod, Pilate, the Roman soldiers, the religious leaders, they all meant the cross for evil. They intended to crush a political and religious threat. But God predestined that specific event for the highest good.
He used their wicked actions to satisfy divine justice. The theological term is propitiation, which means to offer a sacrifice that turns away wrath and satisfies the demands of justice.
And the cross proves that God's good meaning in a sinful act is not wishful thinking.
No, it's historical reality.
If God can flawlessly govern the most heinous sin ever committed, the brutal torture and execution of his own son, and use it to bring about eternal salvation, it means he can govern anything.
If we read Genesis as an instruction manual telling us to be a good forgiver, we turn revelation of divine triumph into a self-help seminar. How does seeing Jesus as the greater Joseph alter the way a person approaches the Old Testament?
It changes how we view the worst atrocities in history. It proves that human evil, no matter how chaotic it seems, can never derail God's sovereign plan. Evil is real, and it is horrifying, but it is on a leash. God uses it to display his own glory and secure the salvation of his people.
Taking this massive theological framework of the cross and God's providence,
Yeah.
we must apply it to modern life. We have to use this robust theology to correct popular yet false teachings circulating today. For instance, this text actively refutes the prosperity gospel.
The prosperity gospel is a false teaching that promises immediate health, wealth, and a life free from severe hardship if you just have enough faith.
But such a theology cannot possibly account for the 13 years of slavery and imprisonment that God actively decreed for Joseph.
Not at all. If Joseph had believed the prosperity gospel, his faith would have shattered in the pit at Dothan. He would have assumed God hated him or that he didn't pray hard enough.
The prosperity gospel tells you that the pit is a sign of God's absence. The biblical theology of providence tells you that the pit is the very path to the palace.
We also see a strong critique of the seeker-sensitive movement, which often attempts to market a domesticated, highly sanitized deity.
Yeah, they want a buddy Jesus, a life coach who is just waiting for you to invite him into your plans to make you a better version of yourself.
But the God of the Bible is the king who, as Psalm 105 says regarding the Joseph story, summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread. He orchestrates empires and famines.
We have to understand the original audience context here. Who originally read Genesis?
Moses wrote this account for the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, having recently left Egypt.
What were the Israelites doing in the wilderness? They were complaining constantly. They were highly pragmatic.
They judged God's goodness entirely by their immediate temporal comfort.
If they didn't have water, God was bad. If they didn't have meat, God had abandoned them. If the road was too difficult, they wanted to go back to slavery in Egypt.
So Moses was essentially preaching a sermon to them through the Joseph narrative. He was telling them, look at how God brought us to Egypt in the first place. He used the agonizing sins of our forefathers, betrayal, slavery, false imprisonment, to orchestrate our physical salvation.
If he can govern the malice of Joseph's brothers to save the world, he can certainly govern this barren wilderness to prepare you for the promised land.
Exactly.
We have to turn this directly to you, the listener. Are you judging God's goodness entirely by your current comfort level? Are you assuming that because you are in a metaphorical pit or a prison of difficult circumstances, God has somehow lost control of the narrative of your life?
True providence requires the believer to trust God in the dark. The pit and the prison were not signs that God had abandoned Joseph.
They were the very mechanisms by which God was moving him to the specific location he needed him to be. How does this specific, weighty view of sovereignty give better comfort to a suffering person than the modern idea that God is just doing his best to fix a broken world, but that tragedy sometimes slips past his guard? Because people say that to be comforting. They say, God didn't want this for you, it just happened.
But if tragedy can slip past God's guard, then your suffering is truly meaningless. It is just random chaos. There is no comfort in a God who is well-intentioned but weak.
Right.
But if God is absolutely sovereign, then behind dark circumstances, he is actively intending good. Understanding that God decrees trials for your benefit, even when inflicted by the sinful choices of others, is the only way to survive intense persecution or personal tragedy without losing your mind to bitterness.
It anchors the mystery in God's character. We don't have to call the evil good. Joseph never called the betrayal good. The evil action was awful. But we must learn to say that God is good even when men mean evil.
The believer's hope does not rest in the ability to decode every single event in real time. You might wait years, as Joseph did, before the grand design becomes visible.
Sometimes you won't see it in this lifetime.
Your hope rests in the God who has already decoded the central providence of history in the gospel.
To wrap up our deep dive today, we have walked through a staggering reality. Human evil is real, and humans are entirely accountable for their wicked choices. Yet God's sovereign purpose arches over it all, flawlessly governing history, always intending good for his people, even through their darkest trials.
The theology of Genesis 50.20 places God securely on the throne of the universe, and it places us in a posture of humility as recipients of unmerited grace.
We want to leave you with a final, lingering question to consider. Think about the 13 years Joseph spent in Egypt before he saw any resolution. He was a slave, then a prisoner, forgotten in a dungeon.
It's a long time to wait.
It really is. If God was meticulously working through those silent, cruel, and seemingly wasted years, what unseen glorious good is him? He actively orchestrating in the most frustrating, unresolved areas of your own life right now.
It changes the way you view the waiting periods of life.
The silent years are never wasted years. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep seeking truth, keep asking the hard questions, and we will see you next time.